by these two authors. Unfortunately, this is a picture I pinched off Amazon, but doesn't matter. The book is by Alan Horwitz and Jerome Wakefield, and it's called The Loss of Sadness: How Psychiatry Transformed Normal Sadness into Depressive Disorder. What they're saying, their complaint is that modern psychiatry is reaching out to try and encompass more and more of normal life. And they say life isn't all about feeling good all the time. Life is about ups and downs. You know, and there's going to be good times and bad times. And one of the bad times, of course, is grief. But you know, if we if we don't want grief, then the only way out of that is not to have social bonds in the first place. But I think that's pretty crazy even to talk like that. So the fourth feature that they listed was that it must reflect an underlying psychobiological dysfunction. Now, this is dangerous thinking. This point is either truism or it's ideology, but I'll also say that it's actually more likely to be just plain garbled thinking. It's truism in the sense that any observable or experienced mental disorder must have a cause in the natural realm, and if that's the case, then it's going to be somewhere in either the psychological or the biological spheres, just because there aren't any others. So if you say that a mental disorder reflects an underlying psychobiological dysfunction, that's a statement on a par with saying of a man, yes, well, he's either dead or he's alive. It's a truism. It couldn't be otherwise. Now, I think that, however, there's a much more ominous trend going on here, and you'd have to go and have a look at this paper, because what they're doing in this paper is they are shaping our awareness of mental disorder, and they repeatedly offer suggestions that in fact it's biological. For example, they said there's a growing awareness of the extent to which all behaviour and psychology are dependent upon brain processes. Now that sounds pretty good until you actually stop and have a look at it. You know, you think, hang on. Do these people know of any serious thinker in the field of human affairs who believes that human psychology is not somehow crucially dependent on the intact functional brain? Do they really? Because I don't know anybody. So this is the sort of thing that goes on. There's these little insinuations and innuendos. It's tendentious writing all the way through, and they're trying to shift you across to the idea that psychiatry is all about mental disorder is all about brain disorder. So you'd actually have to look at my case in more detail in the papers. That's just a brief summary. And the final feature they give is that the mental disorder is not primarily a result of social deviance or conflicts with society. Well, if a lady, for example, has got a house that she's lived in for 50 years and the local council wants to push her house down and put a 5-lane highway through it, and she gets upset to the point where she can't function, technically speaking, she wouldn't be mentally disordered, because her disturbance arises from conflict with society. So I just think that this is very, very poor way of approaching things. The other thing too there is that this just lends itself to labelling people according to their race or their social class. So for example, in Australia, a boy who hates school and wants to leave and get a job in the bush could be deemed mentally ill if he's from the white middle class, or he could be deemed socially deviant if he's from the black poor or lower class. And that's the sort of thing that I think we have to avoid in psychiatry. Psychiatry must never ever be allowed to be used as an agency of social repression, and I think their definition allows that. So we just move on to the other considerations. There's number 6, it's got diagnostic validity. Number 7, it's got clinical utility. Number 8, no definition perfectly specifies precise boundaries for the concept of medical disorder or mental disorder. Hang on. Just let's have a look at this one a little bit more closely. Let's zero in on that one, number 8. No definition perfectly specifies precise boundaries for the concept of either medical disorder or mental disorder. Why did they put that in? I think the only possible reason they could have put that in is because they're trying to pull a fast one. What they're doing here is they're saying that we can't actually specify the categories of mental disorder. Now that's pretty crazy when you look at it from the point of view that DSM-IV and DSM-V is all about categories of mental disorder. That's what it is. That's a bit like it's a bit like saying, you know, football's all about kicking footballs around, occasional head, but mostly footballs. And the whole point of the DSM-5 is to find precise boundaries, but now they're saying they can't do it. So why have they mentioned medical disorder? Well, I think they're trying to say that because the physicians can't be deadly precise in the, excuse that wasn't a very good term, was it, deadly precise, but because the physicians can't be deadly accurate in their diagnoses, then that gives us psychiatrists who have to deal in this sloppy area called mental health, that gives us carte blanche to be to have blurred borderlands too. But there's an extremely important difference between the blurring of the categories in medical disorders. You know, for example, the difference between I don't know, one of the autoimmune diseases and the sorts of total lack of anything that approximates reasonable categorical boundaries in mental disorder. Psychiatric disorder, as I've said earlier, is the categories of psychiatric disorder, as I've said right at the beginning, are based on spurious and artful redefining of the the parameters of mental disorder. And if you take those away, then there's nothing. The whole thing collapses in a heap. So I think that this debating trick that I've highlighted in red here, this is actually a high school debating team trick. You know, if you say because one group can't justify themselves in the extreme case, then that justifies us in getting away with essentially blue murder. And I think that's very dishonest. So try this. Mental disorder is what society says it is. And then the immediate objection from the DSM-5 committee would be, how could mental disorder be biological under that definition? How could that definition relate to the genome? Well, hang on. Who says that mental disorder is biological? Oh dear. This is a problem, isn't it? Because the whole purpose of having categories of mental disorder is to relate them to underlying biological diseases of the brain. If you don't have if you don't have underlying biological diseases of the brain, then no point having categories as surface manifestations. So, you know, I'd say, who says mental disorder is biological? And the counter response from the DSM camp is, now just look at all the evidence. What a silly fellow you are. And my response to that, of course, is, and everybody else, every reasonable thinker would say, don't give us evidence, we want proof. Your evidence may be no more than confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias is one of the inherent biases of human cognitive function. What it says is that when we've got a belief, when we believe something's true, we will look around and find evidence that reinforces it. It takes a lot of discipline, a lot of practice, quite a lot of heartache to be able to have a belief and hold it fairly close to you, something you hold to be fairly important, and yet at the same time be very objective about the evidence that comes your way and just pick up the the supportive evidence and the negating evidence in objectively. That's very difficult. Just take, for example, the people, all the people in the world who dislike people of other races. Well, they'll find lots and lots of evidence to say that people of other races are dreadful creatures and should be deported. So that's just an example of confirmation bias. And I think a lot of the evidence for that is used as used to support the biological model in psychiatry is simply an example of confirmation bias. Now, we would be saying, don't give us evidence, we actually want proof of the statement that mental disorder is just a special case of brain disorder. And we want to go further than that. We want on a question of such importance, we want proof, not just a balance of probabilities, which is sort of civil case in law, not beyond reasonable doubt, which is a criminal case in law, but beyond all conceivable doubt. And that's proof at the philosophical level. What we want of the people who are writing the DSM-5 committee is that we want proof that mental disorder must be biological because it couldn't be otherwise. And just to give you an example of what I mean by this, there's the Aristotelian syllogism, and unfortunately I just realised I've spelled Aristotelian incorrectly, but don't worry. And the classic example is, all dogs have 4 legs. So you start off with that premise. Then you add another premise. This animal is a dog. And from this you draw a conclusion. This animal therefore has 4 legs. So what that says is that given the premises, the conclusion couldn't be otherwise.